The lights blazed hot in the studio. Cameras rolled, the red tally lights glowing like unblinking eyes, capturing every flicker of tension between the two men seated across from one another. The atmosphere was electric, thick enough to choke on, as millions at home leaned forward to watch. Marc Lamont Hill had just begun to lay out his point, measured, articulate, unflinching, when suddenly Piers Morgan lunged in with a smirk, slicing through his words like a blunt weapon. "Rubbish," Piers scoffed, waving his hand dismissively, his voice louder than the man he interrupted. "Absolute nonsense. Don't lecture me," the studio air cracked. Mark froze mid-sentence, not because he had lost his train of thought, but because of the sheer audacity in the interruption. The camera panned sharply to Mark's face, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The audience in the studio sat on edge, some shifting in their seats, others holding their breath, as the tension shot through the room like an electric current. Piers leaned back smugly, arms folded, eyes scanning the studio as if daring anyone to challenge him. He thought he had landed the blow. He thought he had silenced his opponent before the real debate could even begin, but what Piers Morgan did not realize, what the audience at home was seconds away from witnessing, was that Marc Lamont Hill was not going to be dismissed. Not this time. The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then another. The host's attempt at dominance hung heavy, waiting for Mark to retreat. Instead, Mark leaned forward ever so slightly, the kind of movement that said without words, "I am not backing down." And then Marc Lamont Hill did something no one expected. The room, the cameras, the audience, they all seemed to freeze, caught between anticipation and shock as Mark prepared to respond. The intensity was cinematic, the kind of moment that makes history in live television. You could almost hear the collective inhale across the nation. But this was only the beginning of a brutal confrontation that would spiral out of control. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to know what brought these two men to the table in the first place. This wasn't a polite academic debate. This wasn't casual television chatter. No, this was a confrontation born out of the fault lines ripping through America's soul. The subject on the floor was one of the most combustible issues of our time: race, identity, and the limits of free speech. Piers Morgan, the brash British broadcaster who had built a career on provocation, insisted that America had grown too sensitive, too politically correct. He argued that calling out racism had become an overused tactic, a silencing mechanism rather than a pursuit of truth. Marc Lamont Hill, sitting opposite him, knew the weight of every word. For him, this wasn't abstract. This wasn't performance. This was about lived reality, about communities marginalized, voices silenced, truths buried under the arrogance of those who never had to face them. The debate could have ended as one of those endless, circular shouting matches that television churns out daily. But not this time. Not with these two men. Not on this stage. Because here's the truth. This wasn't about one argument. It wasn't even about Piers Morgan or Marc Lamont Hill. It was about something far larger. It was about the struggle for dignity in a society where power, too, often drowns out truth. Every word Mark spoke carried the weight of generations who had been told to sit down, to be quiet, to get over it. And every interruption, every scoff from Piers echoed the centuries-old chorus of dismissiveness that has followed these conversations. The stakes weren't academic, they were existential. As the cameras rolled, you could sense the tension wasn't just in the studio, it was radiating outward, into living rooms, offices, and phone screens across the country. This was about more than television. It was about the defining question of our time. Will truth be heard over arrogance? The producers knew they had something volatile on their hands. The network's social feeds were already buzzing. Clips were being pulled in real time. Audiences weren't just watching. They were reacting, sharing, waiting to see how far this would go. And as Mark leaned back, composing himself after Piers's dismissive interruption, you could almost hear the stakes rising. This wasn't just a man defending himself in a studio. It was a scholar, an activist, a voice for the voiceless, standing against a media titan who represented the machinery of dismissal. The clash wasn't between two personalities. It was between two visions of America, one that silences and one that speaks truth no matter how uncomfortable, one that ridicules and one that resists, one that seeks spectacle and one that seeks justice. The air was heavy with anticipation. The confrontation had already hooked millions, but what was about to happen next would take it from explosive television to cultural touchstone. Because Marc Lamont Hill was about to deliver not just a rebuttal, but a reckoning. And what happens next will redefine how millions view this conversation. To understand why this moment with Marc Lamont Hill carried such weight, you have to understand Piers Morgan himself. For years, Piers has thrived on controversy. He has built a brand not on consensus, but on conflict. A man who never hesitated to cut people off mid-sentence, who relished in being louder, brasher, and more dismissive than anyone else on screen. Piers Morgan is not just a journalist, he is a provocateur. From the very beginning of his career, he wielded arrogance like a weapon, using mockery and volume to dominate rather than debate. He has made a name for himself by poking the bear, by saying the unsayable, by pushing buttons until they broke. In his early years on British television, Piers clashed with politicians and celebrities alike, smirking as he dismissed their arguments. He turned interviews into battlegrounds, not to uncover truth, but to assert dominance. The louder the fight, the higher the ratings. The more offended his guests, the more his audience leaned in. He thrived in the chaos, fueled by the outrage he created. Even after crossing the Atlantic, that reputation followed him. On American screens, he brought the same dismissive bravado, the same refusal to listen. When gun control was debated, Piers shouted down his opponents. When race was discussed, he minimized, interrupted, and scoffed. He seemed less interested in understanding and more interested in winning, no matter the cost, and it worked for a time. Ratings climbed. Clips went viral. His name trended. But beneath the bluster, cracks began to show. His critics pointed out the obvious. Piers Morgan loved to frame himself as the voice of reason, the brave truth-teller unafraid of woke mobs. But time and again, it wasn't bravery on display, it was arrogance. Consider the countless guests who left interviews visibly shaken, silenced not by logic, but by interruption. Consider the moments where Piers smirked, rolled his eyes, or muttered insults under his breath while others tried to speak their truth. These weren't debates. They were performances, and Piers was the self-appointed star, and yet the mask often slipped. Behind the swagger, there were contradictions. He claimed to champion free speech, yet routinely cut others off. He framed himself as a defender of truth, yet often leaned on mockery rather than evidence. He positioned himself as a voice for the people, yet too often dismissed the lived experiences of those very people when they challenged his worldview. It was this contradiction, this gap between the image he projected and the tactics he used, that made his confrontation with Marc Lamont Hill so volatile. Because Marc wasn't just another guest. He wasn't another politician trying to score points. He wasn't a celebrity looking for airtime. Marc was different. He had faced this kind of dismissiveness before, not just in studios, but in life. He recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to silence. For Piers, this was another Tuesday, another clash to boost his brand. For Marc, it was a test of dignity, a chance to stand up not only for himself, but for millions watching who had been told, in one way or another, that their voices didn't matter. And so, as Piers leaned back in his chair, smirking, convinced he had controlled the narrative yet again, the tension grew. His confidence filled the room. He thought the moment belonged to him. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest provocateur. Because for all his experience, for all his volume and bravado, Piers Morgan had never faced someone quite like Marc Lamont Hill. And yet, for all his confidence, he never saw Marc's counterpunch coming. The studio was frozen in anticipation. The clash had spiraled. Insults had been thrown. And now Marc Lamont Hill leaned in, eyes locked on Piers Morgan with the calm intensity of a man who had carried this conversation for a lifetime. This wasn't just about a TV debate anymore. It was about dignity, truth, and a voice refusing to be silenced. Piers tried to interrupt again, his lips parting, ready to bluster his way through. But this time Marc cut him off, firmly, decisively. Enough. The word cracked like thunder. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't theatrical. It was controlled, precise, a scalpel slicing through the noise. The studio went dead silent. Piers, mid-gesture, froze, caught off guard. Marc's voice carried now, steady but undeniable. You sit here, night after night, shouting over people, mocking them, ridiculing their experiences, as if your volume gives you authority. But let's be clear, Piers, arrogance isn't truth. Dismissal isn't evidence. And just because you're loud doesn't mean you're right. The audience erupted in murmurs. Piers's face flushed red, his mouth opening as if to strike back, but no words came. For the first time in this exchange, he looked rattled, not by insult, but by the sheer force of clarity. Marc pressed on, his words rhythmic, deliberate, each sentence landing like a hammer blow. You talk about progress as if it erases pain. You wave away racism as if it's a figment of imagination. But here's the reality, Piers. People don't get to move on when their lives are still being crushed by systemic inequality. People don't get to move on when justice is selective, when voices are silenced, when dignity is constantly up for debate. Every word hung in the air. The camera panned across the studio audience, their faces rapt, caught between disbelief and awe. This wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a reckoning. Piers shifted in his chair, his usual smirk gone, replaced with a tightness around his jaw. He reached for a counter, but Marc didn't give him space. You said, "You people?" Marc's tone sharpened, his eyes narrowing. Do you understand what that means? That's not debate. That's dismissal. That's the language of someone who refuses to see humanity in those he disagrees with. And the fact that you don't even hear it, don't even realize the weight of your words, tells us everything about the problem we're facing. The studio gasped again. Piers's eyes darted to the cameras, then back to Marc, suddenly aware that millions of people were not just watching, they were judging. Marc leaned forward, his voice softening, but only to draw the audience closer. You want to talk about free speech? Fine. Free speech means you can say what you like. But it also means you have to face the consequences when those words reveal who you truly are. And tonight, Piers, you've revealed more than you intended. The silence after that line was suffocating. Even the production crew, usually invisible behind the glass, leaned forward in their seats. Marc straightened his posture, his hands clasped on the table, his voice now resonant with finality. You thrive on controversy, Piers. You've built a career mocking, belittling, tearing down. But here's the difference between us. When I speak, I carry the weight of truth. When you speak, you carry the weight of ego. And ego will always collapse under the force of truth. The audience exploded. Applause, cheers, even shouts broke out across the studio. The sound was deafening, rolling like a wave that Piers couldn't control. For once, the spotlight he craved was no longer his. It had shifted, completely, irrevocably. Marc didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat back, letting the storm of applause wash over the moment. Because this wasn't about victory. It was about vindication. Piers Morgan, the man who had silenced so many voices, had just been silenced himself, not by volume, not by insult, but by the undeniable weight of truth, and the cameras captured every second. Clips would go viral within minutes. Headlines would scream about the mic drop moment. Social feeds would flood with replay after replay, dissecting the exact second the power dynamic flipped. But in that studio, in that charged, unforgettable moment, it was clear the confrontation had reached its climax, and as Marc's words echoed, one line above all stood out. Ego will always collapse under the force of truth. It was the kind of line that doesn't just end a debate, it defines it. Piers sat back in his chair, speechless, the ever-present smirk now gone. For once, there was no comeback, no clever retort, just silence. And in television, silence is louder than any argument. The brutal confrontation had found its breaking point. But as the world would soon learn, the fallout was only just beginning. The debate was technically still underway, but in reality, the moment Marc Lamont Hill uttered that line, "Ego will always collapse under the force of truth," the conversation had already escaped the studio walls. Within minutes, the clip was clipped, captioned, and unleashed into the digital bloodstream. Twitter lit up like a wildfire. Hashtags began trending. During Marc vs. Piers, a truth over ego, a mic drop moment. People who hadn't even watched the full debate were already sharing the 30-second clip, calling it one of the most decisive televised takedowns in years. On TikTok, remixes appeared within the hour. Some paired Marc's words with cinematic music, others with slow-motion zooms on Piers' crumbling expression. The internet had chosen its hero and its villain. Commentators weighed in. Prominent activists praised Marc for refusing to be silenced. "This is what it looks like when dignity fights back," one wrote. Academics shared the clip as a case study in rhetorical power. Even comedians jumped in, turning Piers' stunned silence into punchlines that ricocheted across late-night television. But the reaction wasn't confined to one side. Piers' defenders scrambled to reframe the moment, claiming he had been ambushed, that the clip was taken out of context. Yet every attempt only fueled more engagement. The internet didn't want nuance. It wanted the symbol, the crystallized drama of arrogance being humbled in real time. In living rooms across America, families sat replaying the confrontation. "Did you see that?" Parents asked their children, shaking their heads in disbelief. He shut him down. For many, it wasn't just entertainment, it was vindication. The kind of moment where someone finally said what they wished they could say in their own workplaces, schools, or communities. The ripple effects reached mainstream media the next morning. Headlines blared across newspapers and online outlets. Marc Lamont Hill silences Piers Morgan in viral confrontation. The mic drop heard around the world. When truth outshines ego, the debate clip everyone's talking about. Cable news hosts replayed the footage endlessly, analyzing Piers' reaction, Marc's composure, and the cultural significance. Some anchors admitted openly, "It's rare you see someone stop Piers Morgan in his tracks. This might be the first time he's truly been speechless." And that was the real shockwave. Not just that Marc had landed a blow, but that Piers, the man who prided himself on always having the last word, had been robbed of it. His silence spoke louder than any argument he could have mounted. For Marc, the aftermath was surreal. Invitations poured in from other shows, op-eds requested his perspective, and supporters flooded his social media with messages of gratitude. Many framed it not just as a debate victory, but as a cultural turning point. One viral comment captured the spirit of the moment. This wasn't about two men arguing. This was about who gets heard in America. And tonight, truth finally won. The impact reached far beyond politics. Teachers played the clip in classrooms as an example of standing your ground. Churches referenced it in sermons about courage and dignity. Even sports commentators used it as a metaphor. It was like watching the underdog knock out the heavyweight in one clean shot. Yet beneath the celebration, there was also unease. If a single exchange could capture the attention of millions, what did that say about the fragility of public discourse? If truth needed to go viral just to be heard, what did that mean for the quieter battles happening every day? Still, the dominant mood was clear. People were inspired. They felt that, in a world of noise, someone had finally cut through with clarity and conviction. Marc's takedown had become more than a viral moment. It had become a rallying cry. And as the dust settled, one thing was undeniable. The confrontation had altered the playing field. Piers Morgan, once untouchable, had been humanized, humbled, exposed. Marc Lamont Hill, long respected in academic and activist circles, had crossed into mainstream cultural recognition in a way few could have predicted. The shockwaves were still spreading. But one question lingered, echoing through headlines, comment sections, and conversations at dinner tables across the country. If truth could silence arrogance this time, what might happen next? If Piers Morgan was the provocateur who thrived on arrogance, then Marc Lamont Hill was his opposite, a man forged in struggle, sharpened by experience, and grounded in a commitment to justice. To see Marc sitting in that studio, calm in the face of interruption, you have to understand the journey that brought him there. Marc wasn't born into privilege. His voice wasn't handed a platform. He built it brick by brick, through discipline, education, and a fierce determination to speak truth, even when truth was the last thing people wanted to hear. From his earliest days, Marc understood what it meant to navigate a world that too often dismissed him before he opened his mouth. Growing up in Philadelphia, he faced the same systemic barriers that many young black men encounter. Teachers who underestimated him, communities under siege, opportunities closed off before they began. But instead of bending under that weight, Marc rose. He studied harder, read deeper, and trained his voice not just to argue, but to enlighten. Education became both his armor and his weapon. Marc earned his degrees with a relentless focus, carving a path through some of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. Temple University, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia. Each step was a statement that knowledge could not only liberate, but empower. And Marc never kept that empowerment to himself. He turned it outward, toward communities who needed advocates, toward classrooms that needed teachers, toward conversations that demanded courage. But Marc was not just a professor. He was an activist. He put his body, his time, and his reputation on the line for causes bigger than himself. From Ferguson to Palestine, he stood where dignity was under attack, using his platform to amplify voices that the powerful wanted silenced. Where others sought comfort, Marc sought confrontation, not for the sake of spectacle, but for the sake of justice. And here lies the defining contrast. While Piers thrived on conflict for ratings, Marc endured conflict for truth. For him, the stakes were never about career advancement or notoriety. They were about survival. They were about representation. They were about ensuring that those who had been silenced finally had someone who refused to bow. Still, Marc paid a price for his honesty. Speaking out came with consequences, controversy, smear campaigns, attempts to paint him as radical or extreme. He was no stranger to being misrepresented, misquoted, and misunderstood. And yet, through it all, he remained undeterred. Where others would retreat, Marc leaned forward. Where others compromised, he doubled down. His resilience became his signature, and this resilience carried him into every debate, every interview, every moment where the spotlight threatened to burn. He understood something fundamental. When you walk into a space where power is used to dismiss and demean, you don't match arrogance with arrogance. You meet it with clarity, with dignity, with truth. So when Marc Lamont Hill sat across from Piers Morgan that night, he wasn't intimidated by the studio lights, the cameras, or the interruptions. He had faced louder voices before. He had faced harsher critics, deeper stakes, and far greater risks. This was not unfamiliar terrain. It was a battlefield he knew well. And if Piers saw the exchange as another opportunity to score points, Marc saw it as something else entirely, a chance to show millions that dignity could not be silenced. That arrogance, no matter how loud, could not drown out truth. It is no exaggeration to say that Marc had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Every challenge, every classroom lecture, every protest, every headline, all of it had sharpened him for this. And as the cameras zoomed in, capturing that look of composure on his face, it became clear Marc Lamont Hill was not just another guest. He was the counterforce to everything Piers represented. This was not just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of legacies. On one side, a man who wielded arrogance like a weapon. On the other, a man who carried the weight of history, community, and truth. And as the studio air tightened, as the audience leaned forward, as social media began to buzz, the confrontation transformed into something bigger than either man. It became a test of whether dignity could withstand arrogance, a test of whether truth could outshine spectacle, a test of whether Marc Lamont Hill's lifetime of preparation would rise to meet this moment. Because what was about to unfold would not just challenge Piers Morgan's bravado, it would challenge the very foundations of how debates are fought and won on the public stage. And Marc Lamont Hill, calm, composed, ready, was about to prove why he was uniquely prepared to deliver the blow that no one saw coming. The moment had been set. Two men, two opposing worlds facing each other across the glossy studio table. The silence that followed Marc's steady composure was thick, and then, like clockwork, Piers Morgan went on the attack. He leaned forward, eyebrows arched, voice sharpened like a blade. "You're exaggerating," he snapped. "You academics always do. You talk about racism as if it's everywhere, as if America hasn't made progress. Frankly, it's insulting." The words cut through the studio air, dripping with dismissiveness. Piers wasn't debating. He was belittling. His tone rose, louder and louder. A tactic he had mastered. Drown the opponent in volume, make your voice the only one that matters. But Marc didn't flinch. He didn't meet volume with volume. Instead, he remained still, eyes fixed on Piers, waiting. That patience only infuriated Piers more. "You see, this is the problem," Piers continued, gesturing theatrically toward Marc. "You people, yes, you people, always make everything about race. You twist facts to suit your narrative. Why can't we just move on?" Gasps rippled through the studio audience. The phrase, "you people," landed like a grenade. Even through the television screens, viewers felt the sting. Social media began to light up instantly, snippets of the exchange already clipped, captions screaming, "Did he just say that?" Marc's face remained composed, but his silence was deafening. He didn't rush to fill the air. He let the audience sit with the arrogance, let the weight of Piers' words reveal themselves. Finally, Marc spoke, voice low but cutting. "What you call exaggeration, Piers, others call survival. What you call moving on, some of us call erasure." The contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side, bluster, interruption, spectacle. On the other, dignity, restraint, clarity. The audience could feel it. Piers was rattled. His interruptions grew more frantic, his tone more mocking. Marc, however, only became steadier, calmer, more deliberate. The back and forth intensified. Piers waved his arms, smirked, and tried to provoke. Marc countered with precision, each word striking harder because of the composure behind it. It was like watching a storm crash against a stone wall. The louder it roared, the more immovable the wall appeared. "You're dodging the point," Piers sneered, his voice straining. "You want to paint America as a racist country? That's your game. Admit it." Marc leaned forward slightly, his calm breaking into the faintest hint of steel. "I don't need to paint anything, Piers. The facts speak louder than you ever could." That line shifted the energy. The audience murmured. The studio felt charged, like something monumental was about to break. Piers' smirk faltered for the first time. He blinked, thrown off by the confidence radiating from across the table. He had faced critics before, had shouted down countless opponents, but there was something different here. Marc wasn't rattled. He wasn't silenced. He wasn't playing by Piers' rules. The escalation had reached its boiling point. Insults had been hurled, lines had been crossed, and the world was watching as the confrontation teetered on the edge of explosion. And then, in one breathtaking moment, Marc Lamont Hill paused. He placed both hands on the table, leaned forward, and locked eyes with Piers Morgan. The room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in. The audience leaned forward. Everyone could sense it. The counterpunch was coming, and when it landed, it would change everything. As the dust from the confrontation settled, it became clear that this was never just about Piers Morgan and Marc Lamont Hill. Yes, one man had been silenced while another rose with dignity, but beneath the spectacle lay a deeper truth, one that millions watching could feel in their bones. Marc's calm presence in the face of arrogance reminded people that strength isn't always about volume, and truth doesn't always need theatrics. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is composure. Sometimes the loudest mic drop is spoken softly, with clarity that can't be ignored. In a society addicted to conflict, Marc's example illuminated another path. He didn't just win an argument, he reframed what victory looks like. Victory wasn't embarrassing the other side for sport. It was standing in one's truth without surrendering dignity. It was refusing to be baited into shouting matches designed to obscure the real issues. The confrontation became a mirror for America itself. On one side, the arrogance of dismissal, the urge to belittle, the insistence that uncomfortable truths should be brushed aside. On the other, the courage to hold the line, to name reality even when it's unpopular, to refuse erasure. This wasn't just a debate about ideas, it was a battle over whose voices matter in public life. And that is why the clip resonated so widely. People saw their own struggles in Marc's patience. Workers silenced by their bosses, students overlooked in classrooms, citizens told their experiences don't count. Suddenly, they felt represented. His composure became their composure. His words became their words. The moral lesson stretched far beyond politics. Dignity beats arrogance. Truth outlasts ego. Silence, when rooted in principle, is stronger than 1,000 loud insults. In that moment, Marc reminded viewers that anyone, no matter their platform, has the power to shift a conversation. Not by matching hostility, but by embodying integrity. But the lesson also carried responsibility. If truth can silence arrogance, then each viewer has a choice to amplify dignity in their own lives or to remain bystanders while noise dominates. Marc's stand wasn't just his, it was an invitation for others to take. Theirs. What made this moment unforgettable? Wasn't that Piers Morgan lost? It was that Marc Lamont Hill showed us what it looks like to win with honor. He demonstrated that one doesn't need to outshout a bully. Sometimes, you only need to let their words collapse under their own weight. In a time when many feel overwhelmed by chaos, cynicism, and division, this lesson rang like a bell. Justice doesn't always roar. It can whisper and still be heard. And as millions replayed the confrontation, that whisper grew louder, carrying a promise that outlasted the headlines. Arrogance fades. Truth remains. Lamont Hill didn't just respond to Piers Morgan, he set an example for millions watching around the world, because in the end, this was never about who could speak louder, who could dominate the conversation, or who could win a television segment. It was about something much bigger, the reminder that respect, composure, and courage still matter. That, in a time of noise, truth still has the power to cut through. As the clip continues to ripple across social media, classrooms, and living rooms, the lesson remains clear. Dignity outshines ego. Every single one of us has the power to choose how we respond when arrogance comes knocking. Do we mirror it, or do we rise above it? Marc showed us what rising above looks like. And now, that challenge is passed on to you. If you believe in truth over arrogance and dignity over dismissal, then share the story. Don't let it vanish into the endless scroll. Let others feel the inspiration, the empowerment, the possibility that calm courage can still win in a world addicted to conflict. Subscribe to this channel to join a community that refuses to stay silent, a community that amplifies voices of dignity, resilience, and justice. And if you felt the impact of Marc's stand, drop a comment below with the words, "Truth remains." Because tonight, we've seen how one confrontation can shake the world. But tomorrow, it could be your voice, your stand, your truth, and remember, arrogance fades, truth remains.